The recently released, and this is coming from the Virginia Foundation for Humanities, the recently released White House budget, the blueprint for the budget, eliminates the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities. For 50 years, those two organizations have supported programs like the Virginia Festival of the Book, reaching nearly every American with opportunities to understand, to discover new perspectives, to celebrate, and to reflect. We need, we being at least the Foundation for the Humanities and probably others, we need your help to urge Congress to preserve the NEA and the NEH. Please take 5 minutes sometime soon, hopefully, to call your representatives after the program. It really matters. And for more information, visit the Foundation website, virginiahumanities.org/advocate. So, enough commercials, on to the program. These two authors have written really, really excellent books, and I think you're going to really enjoy today. The first author to speak, is Scott Solomon, author of this book, Future Humans, Inside the Science of Our Continuing Evolution. Scott's an evolutionary biologist and science writer. He teaches ecology, evolutionary biology, and scientific communication at Rice University, where he is professor in the Department of Biosciences. He lives in Houston, Texas, and his book gathers evidence on a variety of cutting-edge research domains to answer the surprisingly unsettled question, or at least unsettled until his book, are humans still evolving? So Scott will go first in just a second. The second author is David Grinspoon. He's the author of Earth in Human Hands, Shaping Our Planet's Future. He's a NASA astrobiologist, science communicator, and writer. In 2013, he was appointed the inaugural chair of astrobiology at the Library of Congress. He's a frequent advisor to NASA on space exploration strategy. As befits a former protege and family friend and collaborator of Carl Sagan, David's time frame of his book is a little bit longer than Scott's. Scott's looks at a couple hundred years maybe since Darwin, and David's book focuses on, and he's asked me to do the imitation, billions and billions of years. So Scott, take it away.
Okay, thanks. Well, first I want to thank the organizers of the Virginia Festival of the Book for the opportunity to be here, and for Dan and David for the opportunity to be on this panel, and all of you for coming. I'm really looking forward to the next hour. So like many of you, I am really fascinated by thinking about the future. And in particular, I am intrigued by thinking about how the future might be different for humans, and especially how we humans might be different in the future. And my perspective as an evolutionary biologist is that evolution is not just something that happened long ago in the past. It's also a process that is ongoing. And as such, I think it's really interesting to try to imagine what our own evolutionary future might be. Now, of course, I'm not the first person to try to think about how to apply evolutionary principles to imagine the future of humanity. One of the first people to do that was H.G. Wells back in 1895 when he wrote The Time Machine. And he was applying what were then fairly new ideas put forward by Darwin and Wallace about evolution to imagine a future scenario in which humans had diverged through an evolutionary process into two distinct species that he called Eloi and Morlocks. Now, that sort of launched in some ways the genre of science fiction. Of course, there's been a lot of other authors and other people who have used that idea of sort of taking evolutionary principles and applying them to humans to imagine a future scenario in which humans have evolved. But the goal of my book was to take what we now know from modern science and use it to try to ask the question, well, are humans evolving today as we would expect that they are? And if so, how is modernization affecting human evolution? And how can we take those same processes and project them into the future in order to make reasonably informed predictions about how our species might evolve into the future? So that was the premise of the book. And so what I want to do is just to share three main points with you today And then I'm happy to elaborate on any of those in the Q&A that follows. So the first point is that my reading of the science today makes it clear that humans are indeed still evolving. And we have three main lines of evidence that support that claim. I'll just briefly mention them, and as I said, I'd be happy to talk more about them later if you would like. One is genetic and genomic data. So the Human Genome Project was completed in around 2001, and since then, DNA sequencing technology has advanced considerably to the point that it is now very straightforward and inexpensive to sequence a human genome. We can sequence them for about $1,000, and it takes a couple of days. That means that we have now sequenced several 100,000 human genomes, and we actually have quite a bit of information about human genetic and genomic variation. And one of the things that does is it gives us information about our own past. And we can actually look for the hallmark of evolutionary processes like natural selection in our own genomes. And in fact, we see many parts of our genomes that bear that hallmark of evolution, of selection having operated. Another line of evidence is actually from church data, church records, because churches are one example of an organization that tends to keep pretty good track of its population, right? And so I'm in a moment read a short section from the book that describes one of the ways in which evolutionary biologists have used church data, church records, to look for evidence of ongoing human evolution. The third is large-scale biomedical studies. So an example of that is the Framingham Heart Study, which has been following people in the Boston suburb of Framingham, Massachusetts, since 1948. And people come in for regular medical exams every 2 years. They have 2 generations of people that have been going in for these regular exams. And that gives biologists really interesting information, not only about heart disease and cardiovascular health, which is the primary focus of that study, but also about evolution. And so combined, all 3 types of data suggest that human evolution never ended, but that it has continued into modern times. And as I believe, we have every reason to expect it will continue indefinitely. The second point I want to make is that modernization is clearly affecting the way that evolution is happening today. And I'll give you just a couple of examples of what I mean by that. One, it comes from an effect of modernization, which is our enormous population size. And I know David's book also references the massive population size of humans. Of course, it has many implications for what we're doing to our planet. But one of the implications for evolutionary biology is that every new baby that is born brings with it about 60 new mutations on average. So every baby that's born has about 60 new mutations in its genome. Now, mutations are the raw material that natural selection uses. So sort of the basic material that is needed for natural selection to take place is genetic variation. So every one of those 60 new mutations is contributing new variation to our gene pool. What that means is that that new variation is creating more opportunity for selection to act in the future. So we clearly live in a changing world, rapidly changing. And if we hope to be able to adapt to it in a biological sense, we need that variation in order to be able to have some raw material for selection to work on. Another example of how modernization is affecting evolution today is through globalization, immigration, our global transportation network. One of the consequences of that is that human populations are mixing today at a rate that is unprecedented in human history. Now, we can state that pretty unequivocally. So one of the things that is doing is also leading to an increase in variation within our entire species as a whole. And we really should start to think about our entire species as a unit rather than as subdivided populations as we once were. Yet another example of how modernization is affecting our evolution comes from the advances in our technology and medicine. One sort of intriguing example, I think, of this is the way that online dating, of all things, might actually be having an impact on our evolution. And that's because, really evolution is about babies, right? So I always say survival of the fittest is a little bit of a misleading term because survival doesn't matter in evolution. What matters is babies. Survival is only relevant because you can't reproduce when you're dead. And so because the way that we are reproducing today is changing in such a rapid way, I mean, think about all of the assisted reproductive technology, in vitro fertilization, etc., but also the way in which we find our sexual partners is changing. Online dating is becoming increasingly common, especially with younger generations. And one of the things it does is it affects the cues that have evolved over millennia for us to be able to make sort of informed mate decisions that are going to be in our own best interest from an evolutionary perspective, at least. For example, visual information is very easily to access, so to speak, through online dating apps and websites, but smell information is clearly not. Until we get sort of scratch and sniff dating apps, it looks like that's going to be sort of biasing the cues that we can use. So the last point I want to make is that it appears that there are some possible game changers in the near future in terms of things that could happen that could potentially take us on a radically different evolutionary course. And so I'll just give you a couple examples of what I mean by that. One is the ability to edit our own genomes in a very deliberate and precise way. So the technology now exists. There's a technique called CRISPR that you may have heard of that allows us to go in and make changes to the human genome in a very specific way. And those are changes that can potentially be passed on from one generation to the next. So one of the things that gives us the ability to do in principle is to actually direct our own evolution in the future. I talk about this only a little bit in this book, in part because I think it takes us in a direction that is impossible to predict. There's no historical precedent for our ability to do that. And so what I do in the book is describe, I think, a scenario in which we will continue to evolve without that type of technology. If we choose to use that technology, which way we go is essentially anybody's guess, in my opinion. The last game changer I'll mention, and this also, again, touches on something that David knows far more about than I do, but that is the possibility of colonizing other planets, which when I started writing this book, I felt was still something that was pretty much on the periphery of sort of what people were talking about. It's become, in my reading, so mainstream now that I was on a flight recently, and there was an article in the In-Flight magazine that basically said we shouldn't stop at Mars. We need to continue colonizing other planets, as many as possible. So this seems to really be becoming something that is becoming part of our general conversation as a society. The reason I think this is relevant to our ongoing evolution is, again, I think it's a potential game changer in that my assessment of what's happening with our species is that we are unlikely, if present trends continue, to evolve into any type of new species as long as we're here on Earth. But I think there is a fairly realistic scenario in which if we do choose to colonize Mars or other planets, that we actually could evolve into multiple distinct species as a result of that. I think I might be out of time, so I could read a short passage from the book, or I'll hand it over.
Yeah, okay. Sure, go ahead.
You want me to go ahead?
Go for it.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right. So I'm just going to read you a short passage from the book to give you a sense of it. And this is a section that comes from a chapter in which I'm describing one of those lines of evidence that I talked about for how humans are still evolving. And it is records from a church that has been keeping track of its population in Quebec, Canada. I wanted to see the evidence for myself, so Milo and I drove through the cobblestone streets of the historic lower Quebec City and up a steep hill to the massive complex of 5-story stone buildings that constitute the Archdiocese of Quebec, the central administrative branch of the Roman Catholic Church in Canada. There we met diocesan archivist Pierre Lafontaine, who was casually dressed and spoke quietly, apologizing for his English, which he rarely has occasion to use. Lafontaine led us into a large room with 3 tables forming a crescent, where he had set out several books in anticipation of our visit. On one table sat a scruffy-looking book with a handwritten label on the cover that read 1859 to 1866. A second typed label indicated that the book contained records of the baptisms, weddings, and funerals from those years, the raw data Milo and Mayer had used. Lafontaine then led us into a long, narrow room containing row after row of cataloged volumes, like the stacks of a modern library, of parish records like the book we had just examined. Here was an incredible source of information about the people of Quebec that spanned more than a dozen generations. It was the sort of data that evolutionary biologists dream of, information Milo could never hope to attain for albatrosses or any species other than humans. The idea to use multigenerational church records to study human demography was first suggested by an Italian priest in 1951 while attending a lecture by geneticist Luigi Luca Cavalli Sforza. Over the next several decades, Cavalli Sforza and his colleagues used this idea to examine how marriages between relatives affected the distribution of particular genes throughout Italy. Beginning in the 1990s, researchers in Finland, such as Virpi Luma, began extending this approach, using local parish records to look for evidence of natural selection having operated in pre-industrial Finnish communities from the 18th and 19th centuries. They did indeed find data that suggested opportunities had existed for natural selection to act on the timing of reproduction among women in these communities, including evidence that natural selection may have acted differently on the wealthy versus the poor, but they could not be certain that selection had actually had any effect. Detecting a response to natural selection was complicated, partly because of the need for sophisticated statistical analyses that can differentiate between the various factors that can cause traits to change through time. In the 2000s, researchers studying wild animal populations began testing for a response to selection using multigenerational data, but the early methods turned out to be unreliable. Jared Hadfield, an evolutionary biologist at the University of Edinburgh, developed a statistical method building on Bayesian generalized linear mixed models to estimate trends in breeding values that solved the problem. Milot met Hadfield at a small conference in the Italian Alps in 2009, and Milot was eager to try the new method on the data he had just acquired from Francine Meyer on the population at Île aux Coudres. As soon as he got home to Montreal, he took his laptop to a cafe and tried it out. When he saw the result, the first evidence that a historical human population had responded to natural selection, he nearly spilled his espresso. Thank you.
Nice.
David, go for it.
Okay, good morning, and thank you all for coming, and thanks Dan and Scott for doing this with me, and thank you to the Festival of the Book. It's really a wonderful opportunity for me to be here. I want to talk to you a little bit about the perspective I bring to my book, and lead you through a couple of the ideas in it, and read you a couple of passages, and then we'll get on to the discussion part, which will be fun. So my history, my day job, my profession is a planetary scientist and astrobiologist. I've been involved in some spacecraft missions to other planets, and I'm very interested in comparative planetology, studying the similarities and differences in the stories of what we're learning about Venus and Mars in comparison to Earth and other planets, and how that illuminates the general story of how planets work, including our own planet. And a part of this book is what we've learned about Earth from going elsewhere, and how that hopefully prepares us to do a better job of now the reckoning with the role that we're playing on this planet. And I'm really interested in the interaction between human history and planetary history. And that's really what this book is about. I attempt to take this astrobiology perspective, where I look at the long view of evolution of planets and the major transitions that can happen to planets, and then try from that perspective to contextualize the transition that is now happening to this planet as a result of our presence here, and sort of almost take that distant extraterrestrial view on humanity and the effect we're having on our planet, and then hopefully come up with some ways in which that might be useful to us in reimagining our role here and dealing with the predicament we're in on this planet. So I want to read you just a little bit from the introduction of the book, where I sort of frame this. Although climate change is the most obvious, it is only one of a large number of interconnected ways in which we have suddenly begun to modify the planet we inhabit. The scientific community is now converging on the idea that we have entered a new phase or epoch of Earth history, one in which the net activity of humans has become a powerful agent of geological change, equal to the other great forces of nature that build mountains and shape continents and species. The proposed name for this new epoch is the Anthropocene, or the Age of Humanity. This concept challenges us to look at ourselves in the mirror of deep time, measured not just in decades or centuries, or even in millennia, but over hundreds of millions and billions of years. We are witnessing and manifesting something unprecedented and still completely unpredictable, the advent of self-aware geological change. As an astrobiologist, I study the possible evolutionary relationships between life and the planets that may host it. I see the Anthropocene as a tricky new step in the long, intricate dance between Earth and its biosphere that has been going on for 4 billion years. There are those who object to the name Anthropocene as being too self-aggrandizing and serving a destructive, human-centered viewpoint. But this epoch is well named because it represents a recognizable turning point in geological history brought about by one species, Anthro. And our growing acknowledgement of this inflection can be a turning point in our ability to respond to the changes we've set in motion. I believe that more than the extreme and undeniable physical changes to the planet being caused by human influence, it is this dawning self-recognition that is really fundamentally different and ultimately promising about the Anthropocene. Many species have changed the planet to the benefit or detriment of others. But there has never before been a geological force aware of its own influence. So then I do talk about, there's a section of the book called Listening to the Planets where I talk about the insights we've gained into our own planet from exploring beyond it. And one of those deep insights has to do with the role of life on Earth, that we've discovered that it's not just a matter of Earth changing and then life evolving to respond to those changes. Over the long run, it's been an interesting feedback where life and Earth have sort of shaped each other, and there's a very deep interrelation, so that not just the atmosphere of the Earth is sort of obviously torqued by life, and all this oxygen and other gases are biological products, but even the rocks themselves are the minerals are different from what they would be on a lifeless planet. And now we're even thinking the interior of the Earth in some ways because of these chemical cycles that move elements between the atmosphere, the surface, and the interior, that even the properties of the interior of the Earth and the convection and the geological history of the planet has been shaped by life in the long run. So Earth is a thoroughly living planet in ways that we didn't realize until we explored the other planets. So Earth went through this sort of juncture that Venus and Mars didn't when it was a young planet and came to life, became thoroughly infested with life. We still don't know if these other planets have life, but they're clearly not taken over geologically and chemically by life in the way that Earth is. And my argument is that now we're at a similar juncture that could be of equal importance, where cognitive processes become a part of the way the planet operates. And that has great peril and, I argue, great promise. I break this down into the inadvertent changes which are dominating our interaction with the planet now, most obviously global warming, but there's a whole host of others where the unintended consequences of acting in ways where we are having global effects but not acting mindfully of those global effects are dangerous and unstable. But there's also this other mode of intentional change, which is more promising and which we have shown examples of. For instance, the ozone hole was an inadvertent change that was quite dangerous. And the good news is that then we had a global discussion, argument really about it, but then the truth won out, and we made global agreements and we're sticking to them, and the ozone hole is being fixed. So there are examples of this other mode of interaction we're capable of having with the biosphere. So I talk about these intentional changes as something that's sort of our current task, but then also in terms of the future of our interaction with the planet, what kind of future can we imagine? One of my points is that it's not enough to talk about what kind of future we want to avoid. We have to have a vision of what kind of future we ultimately want to create. What role should we play on the planet? Can we imagine getting to that point? And I give some examples of this longer potential mode of interaction with the planet where we could it's not just about stewardship, we could protect the planet from some natural disasters that would befall it, that would affect it, left to its own devices. And a couple of those examples, one is, about the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs 65 million years ago, and 75% of other species that were alive at that time. This has happened repeatedly and will happen again. We know the solar system is full of asteroids that cross the orbits of Earth on a long enough time scale. Left alone, there would be a future mass extinction caused by an asteroid. But it doesn't have to be left alone. We know how to find these objects, and I think we actually know how to give the orbit a nudge so that it wouldn't hit Earth. And arguably, if we know about this and we know how to prevent it, then we are obligated to do so. Another example is climate. We happen to, I think we're often under the illusion that left to its own devices, the climate of Earth would be fine and that Earth would be a paradise forever. But that is an illusion because we've come along in this 10,000 year period of relatively warm and stable climate that is an anomaly and won't last. Left, if we wait another 50,000, certainly 100,000 of years, there'd be another ice age or two ice ages, and there'd be mass extinction, and our society definitely wouldn't, our civilization would not survive that. So if we start thinking on a longer time scale, and one of my points is we're obligated to think on these longer time scales if we're going to be able to be responsible members of the Earth community, then we encounter these questions of future obligations to intercede. There's this what lawyers call a duty to rescue. If you see a burning house, you can't just stand there. And in the long run, therefore, I think we have to imagine our technology flipping from something that is threatening the planet with this sort of vandalism that we're inducing on it now to another role where we could prolong not just human but all life, the life of the biosphere. And I'm going to read just a couple, if I have time, a couple other short passages that expand on some of these ideas a little bit, and then let's get on to the discussion. So this one is about planetary defense, the ability to prevent asteroids and comets from destroying the Earth's biosphere in the future. Planetary defense requires the kind of thinking we will need if our global civilization is going to survive the next couple of centuries. It's a good arena for us to practice the art of paying attention for longer than any of us is alive. By aiding our transition to this longer-term mode of awareness and action, the challenge of planetary defense, even absent an approaching asteroid, can help us to survive the next century or two with our civilization intact and thriving. Space defense is ethically simpler than most other proposed or actual large-scale technological interventions with the planet. Here, human interests and the interests of the rest of the biosphere have obvious and large overlap. An asteroid of sufficient size will ruin everyone's day. Doesn't it seem, then, that we have a clear moral obligation to the biosphere to pursue such a project? Why? Well, how do you feel about mass extinction? When I've described past catastrophic die-offs, which is something I've done in the previous 100 pages here, the disappearance of millions of species due to planetary changes of what I call planetary changes of the first and second kind, these sort of accidental random changes. Do these stories seem sad to you? Are these tragedies, or simply nature taking its course like a fuzzy bunny being devoured by a fleet fox in a nature documentary? Random or natural catastrophes, even huge ones, are much easier to deal with than those which are caused and therefore could be averted by us. Because we have at least the possibility of foresight and avoidance, we see the mass extinction that we are currently starting as particularly tragic, and we feel horrible responsibility for it. Now, in this context, think about the morality of not just past and current extinctions, but future ones. If we get through this next century with a stabilized population and a sustainable global energy system, then it may be time for payback. What could we ever do for Earth that would possibly help atone for the damage we are doing now? Maybe humanity can build a planetary defense system to start to make amends for the extinction we are currently causing. As long as we and our descendants are on the case, Earth's biosphere never has to be decimated by another giant impact. Maybe this could be some kind of long-term compensation to the biosphere. First, we need to get a handle on the killer asteroid that is our own reckless behavior. Then, in the future, we may well be able to prevent the next mass extinction. And I had another section I was going to read, but you know what? I think that's good. That gives you a flavor of the kind of perspective I have and what I talk about. And I want to stop because I really want to get on to the discussion.
And if you want to find out what happens, you'll have to read the book.
That's right. That's right. Don't want to give it away.
So I'm gonna ask two short questions, and then we'll go through that pretty quickly and have as much time as possible for questions from the audience. So I've got one sort of pure science question and one that's not so pure. So one area that both of the books address is our new understanding of symbiotic microbes, the microbiome, and how that's changing our very definition of what a human being is. So I thought maybe starting with Scott's biological perspective and your lens on the new findings about microbiome, and then that'll dovetail into David's more philosophic view of it.
Sure, yeah, no, thank you for the question. So, I think it's really one of the, I would say, major discoveries, major advances of the last few decades is the sort of growing realization of the importance of microbial life in general, not even just in the context of human biology, but with respect to our own bodies and our own health and well-being. We are learning quickly that we cannot separate ourselves from our microbes. The bacteria and other microorganisms that live in and on the human body are a part of us. If we were to take all of them and weigh them, they collectively weigh several pounds and can be considered basically like an additional organ, not just in terms of their weight, but also in terms of the functions that they serve. And so with sort of my evolutionary perspective on it is that one of the other things we are learning is, and this is still very much an active area of research, but we're learning that these microorganisms are not just a random assortment of bacteria that we pick up from the environment. We do pick them up from the environment, but many of them are organisms that live only in and on the human body. And what's more, some of them at least, and my guess is we'll learn more about this in the years to come, is that some of these have evolved along with us. So they have been in and on humans and our ancestors for probably millions of years. And so they are, as I described them in the book, they are small partners, right? They do things for us that are important. And if we wipe them out, then we lose them forever. We can't just get new ones so easily. But in fact, that is largely what we're doing, is we sort of wage war on microbes more or less indiscriminately when we use antibiotics, when we use even things like hand sanitizer. These things are more like nuclear weapons than laser-guided bombs, right? They wipe out all bacteria, not just the ones that we're concerned that might cause disease. So I look a little bit in my book about, I have a chapter on this, and I talk a little bit about this history that we're learning about. But, in terms of what that might mean for our evolutionary future, the true answer is we don't know. I mean, there are some experiments in which researchers raise mice or rabbits or other animals in a way that completely eliminates any microorganisms from their bodies, and those animals become very sick. They really can't function well without their microorganisms. Now, I don't know that we're going to face a future without any microbes, but we seem to be trying really hard, and what we can learn about that suggests that that wouldn't be a very healthy or enjoyable predicament to find ourselves in.
Yeah, I love this topic. I'm glad you raised it because it's just so exciting to be alive at a time when scientists discover some really fundamentally new things that change, not just details about what we know about the natural world, but fundamental aspects of our reality. Exoplanets. Now we know there are planets everywhere. We didn't know that a few years ago. And the microbiome, to me, is in that category. That it's sort of what it means to be human is a little bit different than what we thought. I heard somebody on NPR talking about this say, so it turns out that 90% of you isn't really human. And I think the 90% is maybe by mass, but not by number, or maybe it's the other way around. But the number is squishy. But what I thought was that's not quite right. It's not that part of you isn't human. It's that a human being is not what we thought it was. All of that is human. All of you is human, but the portion of you that is determined by the genes from your parents is a much smaller percentage of you than we thought. And this raises all kinds of interesting other questions and conundrums. The person I think of as the sort of mother of the microbiome, even though she's no longer with us, is somebody that I profile in this book a little bit. Her name's Lynn Margulis, and she was sort of a maverick biologist who was really interested in the role of cooperation and collaboration in evolution. She came up with this idea of endosymbiosis, which is that complex cells formed by simpler cells eating each other and merging in various ways in these sort of cooperative or collaborative assemblages then became new kinds of organisms. And Lynn always used to say, you are not an individual, you have never been an individual, because she was really just very tuned to the microbial world and its role. And she's no longer with us, but if anything, that's more true than we know now than she knew when she was alive. And she also, Lynn was one of the co-founders of something I talk about, which is the Gaia hypothesis, which is this new way of looking at life on Earth in which, and I alluded to this a little bit earlier, in which we see life as a complex set of feedbacks with the so-called non-living world. And I say so-called because when you really look deeply into these feedbacks, you realize that the boundaries between the living and the non-living parts of Earth are not as clear-cut as we saw. So it's just part of this sort of new way of conceptualizing evolution where feedbacks and interactions are essential parts, and it's not just the simple survival of the fittest, and it's not all about just competition, that cooperation is important. And now we realize that, in fact, we have these cooperative organisms that we could not live with that are part of us. So I just think that's fascinating. It also leads to, there's a new sort of way of thinking about evolution. People used to argue about Lamarckian evolution versus Darwinian evolution. And Lamarckian was the inheritance of acquired characteristics, which was this sort of idea that Darwinism was supposed to banish because it turns out, well, it's all in our genes. We don't, it's not that, giraffes don't have long necks because they were reaching for the trees and stretching their necks. They have long necks because the ones that passed on long neck genes survived. But now it turns out that with the microbiome, there's a little bit of this inheritance of acquired characteristics because, in fact, when you're born, you get a lot of your microbiome from your mother. And we're always exchanging organisms with each other and with our environment. So it's more complicated than just the genes from your parents passing on everything. So it does allow us to reconceptualize the kinds of things Scott talks about, human evolution. And again, thinking about our future, you realize that it's not as simple a story as we once thought. So I love that. The last thing I'll say about it is I think it makes a really neat metaphor for our role on the planet. One thing I do in the end of this book is I talk about pessimism and optimism and sort of useful pessimism and harmful pessimism and useful optimism and I break that down a bit with a taxonomy of pessimism and optimism, and I talk about the metaphors we use to describe ourselves, and they're often metaphors of crime and disease, and I caution against the simplicity of only using those metaphors. They obviously have some value, but there are other ways to think of ourselves that also contain images of the possibility of change and evolution. And we're in some ways we're like a cancer. It's true, we've been that way. But cancers don't get together and talk about their future and try to reimagine it. So in some ways we're not. So I do have a section where I talk about I present a number of alternative metaphors. Metaphors of childhood and maturity, and there's a few others. I won't lead you all through them, but one I mention is that we are, in a certain sense, we could think of ourselves as the commensal microbiome of the Earth, and the commensal just means the good. There's part, as Scott mentioned, there's some of this microbiome. It's not just germs that are harming us. There's the creatures living inside us that we literally could not live without. Can we be the commensal microbiome of Gaia, of the Earth, and imagine ourselves in a certain sense, infesting the planet, but in a constructive way, as our commensal microbiome does. So I'll stop there.
Yeah. No, I was going to say, if you're looking for a book on climate change that actually leaves you feeling optimistic and like there is a chance, David's book does a really good job for that. Okay, I have to tangent just a little bit away from the pure science things. We're in case anyone hasn't noticed, we're living in a time where, science, environmental degradation, climate change, all these are raging political issues now. And science has traditionally pushed for an apolitical, stay out of the fray, stay in the lab and do your research. On the other hand, the American Society for the Advancement of Science has encouraged scientists to participate in the March for Science coming up in April 22nd. So I was just, for each of your own perspectives, how do you feel about scientists joining into the fray? Whoever wants to start.
I can go.
Okay, go ahead.
I was taught in school that science is value neutral, that it's not about seeking any conclusion, that you're just neutrally interrogating nature, and that we shouldn't be attached to any, that it has no values. It's just about seeing the way the world is. In an ideal world, that's an attractive view of science, because you can see a danger, and you don't want to do your experiment knowing what result you want to find. Then you bias yourself and your results are suspect. But the problem with this value neutral, there's a nobility behind that sentiment, but it's often translated into, so scientists should stay out of politics, just present the facts, ma'am, and let the politicians and other people work it out. The problem with that, of course, is that science is very relevant to some burning, literally, societal issues right now, and I think we don't have the luxury. It would be nice if we could firewall ourselves off that way, but science is very relevant to issues like climate change and nuclear proliferation and environmental poisoning and all these things. And I think that, especially when you're in an emergency, which I would say we are now as a planet and as a country, really, we don't have the luxury to stay out of it. There's a danger in getting politically involved. Those of us, and I work somewhat in climate, although I study most of the climates of other planets, but I work with people that do climate change. For instance, we don't want to get so attached to wanting there to be clear-cut evidence for something that then when we do a study, we're bound to publicize that result more. If there's a danger in that, a legitimate danger to science of sort of getting off that neutral point. But I think we don't have that luxury now. We have to try to do our science as honestly as we can without being attached to answers. At the same time, we do have a certain authority, and I think we're obligated to be involved right now in issues like climate change. And, especially right now when we see that we have a government and a new administration that is really hostile towards the truth of science in some ways. We have an obligation to speak up and say what we know is true and defend what's going on. Again, we go back to that duty to rescue. If you see a burning house, you don't just get out your infrared spectrometer and go, oh, it's 900 degrees, that's interesting. You have to do more than that. And so, and there's a long history of this. Linus Pauling working for the atmospheric test ban. And there have been many times in our history when scientists have had to step off that neutral post and contribute their authority to a movement to rational behavior by our society. And I feel like this is one of those times, and I do intend to participate in the Science March on the 22nd of April.
Yeah. Okay. Scott?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, a really timely question. My view is that whether or not any individual scientist participates in the March for Science is sort of up to them as an individual and how they, what they consider to be important, how they perceive themselves. And but basically, I see the March for Science as actually part of a larger issue. And that larger issue is sort of how scientists engage with the public. And there's a couple of reasons why I think it's really critical that scientists engage with the public, especially these days. And one of those is that there's so much science that is happening today, so much research, so much work coming out, so many new discoveries like some of the things that we've been talking about. And the question is, well, how do people find out about those things? And traditionally that was largely done by science journalism or journalism more generally. And for a number of reasons, although that's still happening, science journalists simply can't there's no way for them to be able to take all of the information that's coming out from science and provide it to the public in a way that is understandable and interesting. So I think that as scientists, we have a real obligation to play a role in that process and engage with the public and talk about what research is coming out, whether it's our own research or that of our peers and colleagues. And so in some ways, the March for Science, we might not be out there marching, giving lectures. I don't know, maybe if that's going to happen. But I think that it is a part of that general engagement with the public. But the second reason why I think it's really critical that scientists engage with the public has to do with basically just putting a face on science and scientists, right? Science is not something that happens robotically. It is something that is done by people. And I think there's a tendency to just see science as sort of textbook results. We sort of find out this list of facts, but science is a human endeavor. And again, one of the things I try to do in the book, and David does as well in his book, is to talk about the scientists, not just sort of like saying, here's what we know, but who are the people that have given us this information? What's that process like? And I think that scientists engaging with the public, whether it's through political demonstrations or talking, writing books and talking about them, or just speaking with your neighbors or whatever it is, engaging with the public is really critical so that people can sort of have a better sense of what is science, who are scientists, what is this process that gives us this information, hopefully making it easier for people in the general public to be able to keep up with science and understand what's happening and use that information to make informed decisions, which then ties it back into policy and politics.
Okay. Well, we've got about 5-6 minutes left. I'm going to go short questions really quick. I see a yellow woman here, or yellow sweater anyway.
Hi.
Okay, thank you. A question for Scott on the issue of demonstrating human evolution from church records.
Yeah.
And I just need a point of clarification. Are you thinking that just by relatives marrying relatives and reproducing, is that the natural selection you're suggesting is happening, or am I missing it?
Yeah, so I didn't really have a chance to talk about what the information is, so thanks for the question. No, basically what we see in church records, church records keep track of things like births and deaths and marriages. And so one of the things that allows researchers to look at is the age at which women have children. And it turns out that the age at which women have children, first of all, this is sort of not an obvious point, it turns out that is something heritable. In other words, we don't know the genetics behind this, but somehow there is a genetic correlation. There's a genetic trait that influences the age at which women have their first child. Furthermore, on average, women who tend to have children, who tend to start having children at an earlier age, will tend to have more children over the span of their lives. And so that is the reason why it has been shown in a number of different populations and different points in time that natural selection favors an earlier start to reproduction. And that is because, as I mentioned earlier, evolution is about babies, right? And so if a trait causes its bearer to have more babies, that trait is going to be more common in future generations. So what we see is that there's this selection favoring an earlier start to reproduction, and we can see that in the church records. I'll just add that it's sort of interesting to add on top of that there is societal pressure for women to delay starting families. So it's a great example, actually, of how we have natural selection operating in one direction and culture or society pulling in the opposite direction. And that's, I think, an important theme for our ongoing evolution.
Okay, I'm going to try and get in as many short questions as possible here in the front. Need a microphone for the... Right in front here.
Question for Scott. You mentioned that you can't reproduce when you're dead, but the freezing of genetic material really defeats that. freezing sperm, freezing embryo, and I think even freezing eggs. But then that led me to some of the scandals of sperm banks where it turns out that a man will have fathered 100, 200, 300 children. And that made me think of, I can't remember if it's Genghis Khan that supposedly has millions and millions of descendants. And that brought me to the boys.
Short question.
Boys from Brazil, the abuse of that kind of reproductive technology. So I just wonder where that factors into what you've been thinking about.
Yeah, I think the question of how assisted reproductive technology generally is affecting our evolution is a really interesting one. And basically, I think the answer is that it's too soon to know, right? So yes, we can freeze sperm and we can freeze eggs. We still need a living mother to put the fertilized embryo in and to give birth. How reproductive technology, generally speaking, which would include those types of technologies, will affect our evolution moving forward, I actually expect that will have a major impact on our ongoing evolution. But in exactly which ways, the first in vitro babies are in their late 30s now. And so we don't yet know what the impact is on them and their ability to have their own children. So I think it's too soon for us to really know.
Okay, let's see. Question here in the white.
Space travel. Years ago, the calcium problem for the astronauts couldn't absorb calcium once in space. Is that a prophylactic issue still? And also this new microbiome seems to implicate that every Earth-type planet has its children and that they're quarantined to that planet. So does John Brandenburg's revelation of civilization evidence and symbols and numbers on Mars going to change any of your thinking?
Well, yeah, I think space travel is turning out to be more tricky than we thought it might be, given things that we're learning about ourselves and our needs. There's calcium, the problem, there's things that happen to muscles, there's degeneration of the eyes, there's the cumulative radiation doses that you get. None of this is going to stop us from going to other planets, because I think human beings fundamentally are like cats, and we're more curious than is necessarily good for us, and if there's a door, we'll go through it, even if we get stuck somewhere, because like cats, that's the way we are. But I do think, and the microbiome, how that plays in is an interesting question. Is another reason why I think it's going to be harder for us than we thought. You remember the Biosphere 2 experiment where they thought, we'll just close ourselves off and show what it's like to build another human biosphere. And we learned a lot by the fact that experiment failed. It's not as easy. Biosphere 1, where we all live, is more complex than we thought. And this layer of the microbiome is a whole other layer. I think that when the first people who try to go and form settlements on Mars, I predict they'll fail, or at least it'll be harder than we thought, because we'll learn things about what we need on Earth that we take for granted. And the microbiome is fascinating, that we realize that there's this whole level of interaction we have that we need that we didn't even know about a few years ago. One of my friends and science fiction writer I really like, a guy named Kim Stanley Robinson, has written a lot of interesting speculative fiction about some of which deals with the future of humans trying to go live on other planets. And in one of his most recent novels, it takes place 300 years in the future, and people are living on other planets, but it turns out that you can't stay away from Earth for that long. That you need to, every year or so you need to come back for a while for your own health. And who knows, maybe it'll end up being something like that.
Okay. There's a question here. Okay.
I'm curious, what role do you think that nanotechnology will have in the near-term evolution of humanity?
That's a great question. I think nanotechnology is clearly advancing rapidly, and there's the opportunity potentially for implanting devices, or for having some ways in which we are essentially merged with technology. In terms of how that will affect our evolution, I see that, in the short term at least, largely affecting survival. And as I mentioned earlier, for it to be relevant to evolution, survival is an aspect. But if that sort of technology itself isn't passed from one generation to the next, then in a sort of a strict definition of evolution, it wouldn't really be evolving. If it increases lifespans, if it causes people who wouldn't otherwise have children to be able to have children, then there could be evolutionary implications. But until the technology itself actually can be directly passed from one generation to the next, I don't see that sort of radically altering the course of our evolution in the way some of the other things I mentioned might. But of course, that's a short-term vision of how it might affect our future.
So you're defining evolution in that sense as our biological evolution, what's changing our genes, because one could imagine it will really affect our evolution in the broader sense of the change of what we are and how we interact with one another in the world, but that wouldn't necessarily be passed on genetically.
Absolutely, yeah, good point.
Okay, let's see. Right here in front.
Well, that raises the whole question of the singularity. So, which theorizes that technology, the technological and the biological, will merge, and then you'll have this whole new species, this android type species. Which, if that happened, it sounds like science fiction to me. But if it happens, it's predicted by certain people.
Wait, let's stop because we're almost out of time. But quick reactions to...
Yeah, well, Scott mentioned the idea of game changers that are very hard to predict, and you're touching on one here. There's no doubt in my mind that artificial intelligence and its either merging or close integration with humans will change our world profoundly in the next century. And it's one of these game changers that's hard to predict. Nobody, I think, honestly knows what that's going to look like. And some people talk about this singularity where there'll be this moment where artificial intelligence gets good enough to surpass humans, and it doesn't stop there because then the machines can design faster machines and you have this sort of intelligence explosion. And the people that talk about this the most are almost religious about it, Ray Kurzweil and his followers. And it's almost like they're imagining the techno-rapture, where we'll all upload to and they may be right, but they're overconfident because I think they think they know what consciousness is, and honestly we don't. And so it's interesting to explore these possible futures. They're really more science fictions than they are scientifically verifiable predictions. One of them will probably turn out to be right, but there's a whole range of what that might look like.
Anything you want to add? Or?
No, I think that's largely correct. I think, again, these types of things that would fundamentally take us on a new path, the way I try to think about it is what precedent can we use to sort of figure out how that would take us into the future? And I think there is no precedent. So essentially, people who are writing about this in terms of science fiction, their guess is as good as any of ours.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know if this thing works.
Yeah.
Climate change, technology change are going unbelievably rapidly. And as far as I am aware, the human generation time, if anything, is getting slightly longer. To me, this seems like a big mismatch. And I wonder if you could comment on how that mismatch might be resolved. In other words, can we evolve quickly enough to keep up with the changes that we ourselves are creating?
Yeah, well, H.G. Wells described human history as a race between education and catastrophe. And if anything, that's accelerated. And you're right, the processes of evolution that Scott described so capably are too slow to save us from ourselves with these accelerating technological changes. Fortunately, we're not just dependent on those processes because we have this amazing plasticity, the human race, that we've shown time and again. If you look at our history, we've reinvented ourselves through learning new mechanisms of cooperation and invention, and that is our task now. We can't wait for evolution to save us. We have to save ourselves with awareness and education and a dawning recognition of the situation we're in. And there's no doubt in my mind that we are moving towards that kind of awareness and dawning, but the question is, can we do it fast enough to avoid some great level of damage? The human race learns always through some combination of foresight and tragedy. And I think that this next century is going to be no different. It's going to be some combination of those two.
Time for one more question. Okay, up here in the front.
For Scott Solomon, do you see evidence that humans are evolving to become more altruistic?
The question is, do I see evidence for humans evolving to become more altruistic? That's an interesting question. So, what I didn't mention is that my primary research is not on humans. It's actually on ants. And so ants are an interesting, analogy to humans in many ways. Ants arguably are among the organisms that at least appear to be the most altruistic, right? You have a colony that the worker ants forego their own ability to reproduce to help the colony. But what we know about altruism from looking at species like ants is that there's really no true altruism, at least in the animal world. And what I mean by that is that we understand altruism to have evolved because it is actually in an individual's best interest to find ways to pass on its own genes, whether it's doing it directly by reproducing or by helping close relatives to reproduce. So the altruism that we see in humans, or that we like to imagine exists in humans, is kind of an aberration in a biological sense, in that we don't really see parallels in the animal world. So in terms of whether I see us evolving to be more altruistic, if we become more altruistic, I don't think it will be as a consequence of evolution. It will be because we choose to do it deliberately because we believe it's important.
Oh, speaking of things that are important and deliberate, we're out of time. So please complete your evaluation forms. The authors will be staying afterwards to chat, and again, their books are available for sale. They're really, really good books. And thank you for coming, and please join me in thanking the authors for a really good presentation.